Welcome to JLF with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we are here with Shaiel Ben-Ephraim, the host of the History of the Land of Israel podcast and the host of the Israel-Palestine Report on YouTube. Shaiel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So you're one of those people, I think I just told you this, that a lot of people over the last couple of months have been sending me, tweets of yours. You have a pretty big following on Twitter and, you say things that are provocative. And so you obviously get a lot of people debating in the comments. Let's start with, I think, one of your most recent claims. We'll kind of start narrow and then go broad. You recently wrote on your Substack about a month ago an article, this isn't verbatim, but I used to say Israel was not committing genocide. Now I think Israel is committing genocide. So why don't we set the stage? I mean, give me the argument for Israel committing genocide, and then we'll take a step back and I'll sort of ask you about, where you came from and your wider views about the conflict. But let's start narrow and then we can go broad.
Yeah, so it really was not a fun conclusion for me to come to. It's been very unpleasant and it's had a lot of repercussions since. But I stand by that article and I stand by the conclusions. So um, genocide, I won't get too far into all the legal arguments around it. I think we tend to legalize it too much when there's a strong moral element to it too. But you have two elements there. You have that you're doing things that are intended to destroy part of a group, and that you also have a legal motivation to do so. And I think that in the case of Gaza, that level has been reached quite clearly. I'd have to, it would be challenging for me to go back and see exactly when that point was reached, probably long before I said so, because I was a little bit in denial. But definitely has been reached quite a long time ago. Um, and the reason for that is that there's certain actions that Israel is taking that seem to have very little to do with defeating Hamas or any kind of military goal, and which harmed the population greatly, and which seemed to fit much better into an Israeli attempt at destroying the Palestinian people. And then you also have a lot of statements from Israeli leaders that um, reinforce that perspective, that reinforce that motivation. We've all seen them. In the case of Israel, it's rare that Israeli politicians will actually say, "I want all Palestinians in Gaza dead," although that can be understood from the comments of a few politicians like Nissim Vaturi, who wanted to throw an atomic bomb on Gaza and so on and so forth. There's a few of those. But what we see a lot more commonly from just about every Israeli leader, including ones that are considered more moderate, is to destroy Palestinians as a national group, as a group that has rights of self-determination. And that is very similar, I find, to what we saw in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So, there's a lot of comparisons to the Holocaust, and I've fallen into this trap too. But this isn't like the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a very specific kind of genocide. Doesn't have that much in common with it. Very similar to the kind of genocide we saw in Yugoslavia, where there were attempts to wipe out national groups. It's not so much that the Serbians didn't want anyone Bosnian left alive or something or anything like that. It's that they wanted to kill enough Bosnians and deport enough Bosnians that there was no Bosnian national movement. And that's to a great extent what we're seeing in Gaza. The means matter less. Are we going to deport them? Are we going to kill them? Are we going to beat them into submission? Are we going to build so many settlements and make their life so miserable that they leave on their own? So on and so forth.
Yeah, I guess
Basically,
I mean
yeah,
just a couple thoughts. 'Cause I wanted to pause you there. I don't know if this, this is definitely pushing back. But I'm trying to think of the
yeah, push
angle.
back.
I do know that for the YouTube algorithm, if you call something a debate, it pops up on a lot of people. So maybe I'll
Eh,
have to call it anyway. The
Let's do
couple things that strike me are, there's it seems like what you're saying is there's different types of genocide, right? So we have, the Holocaust as genocide of, mass rounding up, mass extermination, all the way to another type of genocide where if you were to use that as your definition of genocide, a lot of things in the 20th century could be considered genocide. The example that popped into my head is, you know, did Iraq or Egypt commit genocide when they essentially, pushed out many of the Jews there? And so, I don't know if you would consider that also, a part of genocide because it was trying to, systematically remove, Jewish culture and Jewish national presence certainly from the area. But usually, and this is sort of the question that I would ask for you, because, just following your work for a little bit, I mean, you are, obviously privy, personally to there's also been anti-Semitism as a part of this wider anti-Zionist push. Not all criticism of Israel, of course, is anti-Semitic. I think, it would be ridiculous, in my opinion, for somebody to conclude you are anti-Semitic. So I'm sure you've gotten that before, but, in my
I
mind,
get that every day, but
that
yes,
is,
I agree it's
yeah.
ridiculous.
So in my mind, that's, a ridiculous claim, but it's not ridiculous to say, well, listen, there are some genuine anti-Semites that have, since the morning of October 7th, been saying Israel's committing genocide, Israel's committing genocide. And then when people say, well, there's genocide and then there's genocide, and technically, if we squint, one definition of genocide what Israel's doing fits, can that actually give credence to those that are saying, see, we have an Israeli scholar who's Israeli himself. I'm assuming you're Israeli based on your name. I don't actually know, who studies this, who, has actually, changed his mind. I'm saying, does that, one, you could even discuss, the general, but even in terms of I guess the optics, I don't know if that's a word that you've thought about. I mean, what would you might do with that argument where now, if on all sorts of, genuine, things that both of us might agree, okay, this is anti-Semitism when you're just another.
Listen, what you say does give me pause, has given me pause. There are a lot of malign actors who use the term genocide, use the term apartheid, and those sorts of things for their anti-Semitic agendas. And that's very unfortunate. That hasn't stopped. And that's, I think, been a chilling factor on my willingness to say that this is what it is. But I would push back quite a bit on what you said about the squinting in a certain way to make it look like a genocide. That's belittling. We have a very serious problem with what's happening in Gaza, and one of the reasons I say what I say about it being a genocide is because I weigh those two concerns: anti-Semitism that we face as a result of what I say or what Jews say, and what's happening to the people in Gaza. What's happening to the people in Gaza right now is absolute hell. And my main concern right now isn't so much what's happened in the past, although that's severe enough. It's what's going to happen in the future. And what's going to happen in the future in Gaza if the current operation goes ahead as planned and maybe even gets worse in the future is going to be a much higher level of genocide than it already is. And preventing that right now is my main concern. And what I say to people who tell me, listen, you're flaming anti-Semitism and you're contributing to the goals of anti-Semites and so on and so forth, is that my tweets and my Substack, as much as you should all be following me and reading it, are doing a lot less to fan anti-Semitism than the actions of the Israeli government. Okay? There's no question that anti-Semitism would exist whether the Israeli government was peace-loving or not. And there's no question that if Israel fought this war according to international law fairly and treated civilians better, there'd still be people calling this a genocide. But there's a lot of reasonable people out there who see what Israel's doing and are horrified. And they're rightfully horrified because the pictures coming out of there, which are real, um, are inexcusable. And it's turning a lot of people almost into maybe even into anti-Semites because then they see a lot of what the anti-Semites are saying. They say, yeah, they have a point. And these are people who wouldn't be anti-Semites otherwise. And I think this is what we miss sometimes in the conversations on anti-Semitism. We look at it as some kind of, fate from God, but that's more your territory. It's more the theological territory. Um, I think that there's a lot of normal human beings who wouldn't be saying anti-Semitic things, this wasn't happening. And if this ended, they would stop, right? They would start seeing Israel in a better light eventually if Israel stopped doing what it's doing. I think the most important thing in order to fight anti-Semitism right now, and in order to defend Israel right now, is to make Israel stop what it's doing. That's much more important than stopping people who are criticizing Israel. Because what I get a lot from people who I'm told are anti-Semites and I'm told are horrible anti-Zionist scum and Nazis and whatever, what I get told by them is people like you make me think that Israel still has a chance of being a better country and of being a moral country. That's something I get a lot. I do a lot more to make Israel's image be positive than the very pro-Israel Kahanist accounts and voices that talk about killing Palestinians that just make people hate Israel and hate Jews more. What we
Yeah,
need to
I can definitely see that. I don't think you're going to be signing up. The Hasbara, I don't think is going to sign you on anytime soon. But you might be right in those spheres. The other sort of question, I mean, I sort of break this down into two questions because Ehud Olmert, former prime minister, I've actually interviewed him on the podcast a couple days ago. He came out with this, op-ed talking about how the war has, overstepped the red line. Moshe Lichtenstein, for listeners who aren't aware, he's the head of, Yeshivat Har Etzion, over the green line, in Alon Shavut, the son of obviously the great Reb Aaron Lichtenstein. He just came out and said the war was over a red line, but neither, Rabbi Lichtenstein or, former Prime Minister Olmert said that this was a genocide. So, I mean, one could think this is a stupid war with, led by politicians who don't actually have the best interest of the Israeli public, Bibi and, his whole cabinet. Bibi's obviously under, investigation for a myriad of things. And obviously, much of the current Israeli government is sort of this, calculation that Bibi's doing. How much concessions do you give to both the far right nationalists and the Haredim at the same time while trying to, it's sort of like this dizzying amount of, power balance game. One might think that, and yet still one could say, well, given the cards that Israel's been dealt, even though, if I'm picking teams from, an a priori situation, I'm not picking, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and Bibi to be the team captains here. Even so, so long as Hamas, has holds on to the hostages and everything like that, that stops it from being a red line. Now, if Hamas released the hostages, tomorrow and Israel continued to do it, then I think, it would almost be a pretty strong argument that what Israel is doing clearly oversteps some ethical line. I don't know if I'd call it genocide yet, but that would be, clearly okay, well, what is the point of what you're doing unless you really think you're going to militarily defeat Hamas, which seems too vague of an idea to actually exist, but at least the sort of narrow goal of, victories through strength of returning the hostages, right? Even if I don't think that might not be the best way to actually get them back, there are at least some, there is some rationale to that isn't just because, when I hear genocide, what immediately comes to mind is, you kill men, women, and children, no rhyme or reason, just for the fact of their very identity. And Israel, I mean, in my opinion, I'm curious if you actually agree or disagree with this claim. Israel, what I've always said, and, when I talk to a lot of students on campus about this, the thing that one could indict Israel for, and, tell me if you agree or disagree with any part of this, is that in other, military engagements, the threshold for Israel to say, bomb a house or a hospital or a school was, let's say a 7. I'm going to give arbitrary numbers. And this war, for a variety of reasons, both the government, probably the shock of October 7th, probably a couple other factors, Israel's lowered it to a 2. And so, whereas Israel used to say, well, if there's a bad guy in this house, we're going to be very careful to reduce collateral damage. In this war, Israel essentially said, who cares about all that, bureaucratic nonsense? Let's just bomb. But still, and this is the part that I want to know if you agree on, Israel isn't happy when it's discovered there were 3 toddlers in that house that you had to bomb to kill the terrorists. So, even, the intent of what Israel's trying to do, like if Israel can snap their finger and any Hamas militant would die, today, and no other person in Gaza without Hamas would, be there still, like I'm guessing 99% of both the Israeli public and the Israeli Knesset. I'm sure there's, one crazy holdout, Kahanis there, but, 99% of the Knesset's probably taking that, easy wager, for doing that. And that's obviously different than a lot of other genocides, even the genocide you mentioned in the 90s, which really was like, no, we actually are trying to kill some, eradicate a population here in a much more systematic way. So I'm curious what you would do with those pieces.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we've as bad as by the way, what you're presenting is absolute war crimes. Like the fact that you're not differentiating enough is a war crime. But unfortunately, we've gone way beyond what you're saying. Everything you said is true, by the way, but we've gone way beyond that because what I think this conversation that I had with someone in the IDF was definitely just a few days before I wrote that article, and I don't think that's a coincidence. We were talking about the water supply in Gaza, and back in my time in the army, we used to map out the infrastructure in Gaza in order to avoid it. And he was telling me that they map out the infrastructure in Gaza in order to hit it. What do I mean by infrastructure? We were talking about the water infrastructure. So basically, the IDF makes sure that there is no clean water in Gaza. It bombs anything that salinates water, that cleans water. It bombs wells. It bombs any supply. Um, the main reason for that is to make life unlivable in Gaza so that the people will be encouraged to leave. Now, once you are destroying all the clean water, you're going to kill off children. By the way, if you see children who are very sick, and you see adults who are not, because children have trouble drinking all this polluted water, among other things. Elderly and the healthy develop parasites, which over time can cause all sorts of diseases and kill you. I would, uh, I believe from what I've heard from doctors that the vast majority of the population of Gaza has serious parasites at this point because of the water that they're drinking. This is an intentional policy. This is an example of an intentional policy. The starvation of the population is an intentional policy. People talk now, at first they were saying, oh, Israel's providing all the aid people need. Then they were saying Israel's providing enough so that they don't starve to death. The only reason Israel's providing enough so it doesn't starve to death is because of massive external pressure. If it was up to the government and if it was up to the Israeli public, people would be starving to death in much bigger numbers. By the way, people have died of malnutrition. The number is disputed between 59 and several hundred. Then there's something else. You talked about snapping your fingers and getting rid of Hamas. Anyone would take that deal. But if you had another proposition, what if you snapped your fingers and all the Palestinians were gone? I think most Israelis would take that proposition over getting rid of Hamas. And that's based on polls that show that 70 to 80%, depending on which poll you're looking at, think that the Palestinian population in Gaza needs to be removed to somewhere else. They support the Trump plan. They support more than that. They support forced relocation of the population. That started around the beginning of the war. I think before the war, there already was a strong contingency constituency for that. Now it's the vast majority, and they would want to get rid of it. And it's true that if you gave, I think the average Israeli the chance of saying, okay, they'll disappear with dying or without dying, most Israelis would probably say without dying. But unfortunately, in order to get all the Palestinians to leave, you have to put them in a situation where the suffering and the death that they're going to experience is going to be at such a high level that it qualifies as genocide and it's intended as genocide. And I think that on a moral level, forget the legal level, it's important to, instead of making excuses for this behavior, to come out against this behavior. And it's better to err on the side, and I don't think I'm erring, but it's better to err on the side of saying this is a genocide and needs to be stopped than say, well, it's not quite a genocide, go ahead.
Well,
Because
I do think,
I'm
I
not
mean, to
saying
your
you're
point
doing
that
that.
this,
I'm not
yeah,
saying you're
yeah.
doing
No. I'm saying just in general. I mean, reflecting on, I think, what's at stake for the Jewish community, within this conversation is, many people listening to this, their emotions are going to be very high, and they might feel, anger at either one of us. I'm, and
mostly me, I
and
promise.
exactly. Well, if they're my listeners, but I'm hoping that you'll eventually also share this podcast, so maybe some of your listeners will get upset at me. And for me, a lot of this is, just a very important moral and intellectual debate without really, I mean, I'm emotional because I care about the Jewish community in Israel and Jewish ideas, you know, but I do think, the reason why many in the American Jewish community, I'll put it this way, are not willing to err on the side of, if it's 60% of a genocide cult or 40%, whatever, is because of what I open with, which is, on campus and in the West, on the morning of October 7th, people were defending October 7th as a great uprising against the genocidal IDF that, again, there is another claim that, people make. I don't think you would agree with this, that Israel has been engaged in a 70-year genocide. I mean, if you agree with that, let me know. You
I
seem to
don't.
be shaking, you are shaking your head just for people listening, audio. So you think that the Israeli genocide only started maybe a year ago, or whatever the date we want to give. But there are plenty of people who the very existence of Zionism, from the 1890s through the last 130 years, it's just been, one massive 130-year genocide. And so the reason why I think so many people are not willing to err on the side of genocide, I mean, I sort of feel, this was similar in a much less, tempers flaring way. I felt this with debates about, is Israel an apartheid state, that I was having when I was an undergrad 10 years ago, where, you look at a lot of what Israel's doing in the West Bank, and again, I kind of do think it's one of these, optical, I know every historic and moral and ethical argument for why one can and should be pro-settlement. I grew up in the religious Zionist community, went to B'nai Akiva camp, went to yeshivas that were all religious Zionists. And I also understand every moral, political, historical argument for why, hey, this kind of makes no sense to have, two different populations under two different legal systems here. So I totally get that. But the reason why even 10 years ago, I would never, you know, post on Twitter or whatever the equivalent was when I was in college, Israel is an apartheid state, is because so many other people, that is the claim that's sort of being levied off. So, like almost an equivalent that kind of comes to mind. Let me know if this is unfair, because I don't mean to say this, flippantly. I don't want to be one of those people that's sort of, dogpiling on you. But many people, and you can let me know if you agree with this claim of many people, have compared some of the claims of what Israel is doing to, historic blood libel, right? These ideas that Jews in the medieval, Christendom would, kill Christian babies either for ritual purposes or for pleasure or sport or, some, nefarious mixture of all of it. So say there was, a case in medieval England where, a Jewish doctor was, showed up to work drunk and, instead of doing something that could have saved a Christian boy's life, he, was being negligent and killed the Christian baby. It would probably be unreasonable for that local English or French Jewish community to put on the front page of, the Jewish Times in, medieval Paris, Jewish doctor kills Christian baby, even if it's true in that case. And even if that doctor should get all the, have to watch all the videos or whatever the equivalent was of, compliance videos in the 12th century, I think from, some perspective, it would say, okay, but there is this, much larger context that this is happening. And so I'm curious, that's almost, what kind of dawns on me, because, we were actually just talking before this about the, before we started recording about the judicial reform and, how we were both in some way part of the anti-judicial reform movement, which, feels like a bajillion years ago. It was only about 2 years ago, just for listeners. So, I don't think either of us, I'll speak on behalf of you also for this claim, we don't feel any love for the current Israeli government for a whole variety of reasons. So I have no desire to, protect the political and moral scruples of Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, historians and, other people can do that. But I do have this desire to, contextualize a lot of the hatred that's going Israel's way within this broader anti-Semitism. It does create a very tough problem because, I do think we constantly have these two sides of, on the extreme on one side, any criticism of Israel is ipso facto anti-Semitism, but that's in some way run its course. You can't say Yair Golan and Ehud Olmert and Moshe Lichtenstein, they're not all anti-Semites. You might disagree with them, but I can promise you Moshe Lichtenstein is not an anti-Semite, right? If there's one person I'm sure of, I will put my, all cards on the table. On the other hand, on the flip side, I mean, either if it's Soviet propaganda or what's coming out of, Iran or even what's been cycled on college campuses, there is a lot of just pure anti-Semitism here that is echoing the blood libel. So that's sort of more, I'm wondering, do you think that medieval comparison is fair at all? I know that's a very loaded question.
No, no, I absolutely don't think that it's fair. I think there's a lot of problems with what you're saying. I totally sympathize. And it's a lot of Jews feel exactly that way, but I think it's very misleading. First of all, we need to realize, and this is goes against our entire DNA as Jews, that we are not the weak side here. The state of Israel has worked very, very hard to become strong. And the state of Israel has worked very, very hard to become stronger than the Palestinians. And luckily for us, we succeeded. That's a good thing in the sense that no one's going to eradicate us. The Palestinians certainly can't eradicate us. We, on the other hand, can eradicate the Palestinians. And we are working right now towards doing that. um, that makes us responsible for what happens. In this case, in the case not in the global context necessarily, but in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're not the Jews, we're the Gentiles. We are the stronger side. Our blood libels against the Palestinians have much more effect than their blood libels against us in Israel. Now, part of this is because I'm Israeli and you're American. So we're looking at things a little bit differently. And I acknowledge that. But from the Israeli perspective, and Israelis still, not all, but many, see themselves as the weaker side, and we're not. Uh, it's not that we're the strongest in the world. It's not that we don't have any threats to our security. We do, but so does the United States, and so does every other great power. We're the strongest in the context of the Palestinians. And we're not talking about some doctor here. We're talking about a state. We're talking about a state that represents its citizens and that, for good, better or for worse, does represent Judaism to some extent. We can get into how much, and I'm not saying this because I want it to be that way. I kind of wish it wasn't that way, but so I'm not prescribing this as a good thing, but it is what it is, right? People identify Israel with Judaism. So we have a lot of responsibility for ourselves and for others. We're not innocent victims here. There's some element of victimhood still. I'm not stupid. I'm aware of anti-Semitism. I'm aware of Iranian enemies. I'm aware of the people who want to kill us. But we also have a lot of agency here. We give the Palestinians agency in this conflict, and they have plenty. But honestly, we have more because we're more powerful than they are. So we just have a ton of responsibility here. And we can't pretend that we're still a bunch of powerless people trying to deal with a hostile world. And more than that, beginning of this war, sure, there were all these anti-Semites on October 8th saying this was a genocide immediately, right? Immediately. But there was something else too that we forget because it's inconvenient, which is that we got so much support from the world. You know, the Brandenburg Gate and the Eiffel Tower and the Empire State were all lit up in Israeli colors. People were willing to support us. People supported us for months. The truth is, I am shocked that we still have as much support as we do from government after 18 months of this.
Well,
Um,
I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but if any Western country now still had, dozens, if not at the outset, hundreds of hostages in a foreign neighboring country. I mean, this is sort of, I don't know if you want to go I don't even know if it's whataboutism, this sort of comparison, but the things you always hear, I mean, we're both in California here, right? Like, if an armed group in Tijuana kidnapped, a couple hundred American citizens from California, I mean, you better believe, I mean, America would probably be doing the same thing, if not worse, than Israel doing. And I think a lot of Western countries kind of understand this. And so there still is, I mean, that effect of, again, because in a lot of people, and I'm not saying I don't know enough about your writings to know if you're one of these people, but when I see a lot of people talking about, the ethnic cleansing or genocide or whatever they want to classify the war in Gaza is, the hostages are almost never talked about. I'm sure you do talk about the hostages. It sounds like you do, but on campus when I just am in casual conversation with people about this and we're sort of going back and forth, it's almost like people have forgotten they exist. Now, it's an open question. I'm not sure how much somebody like Itamar Ben-Gvir cares about getting the hostages back. That, you can totally convince me he doesn't care at all, meaning I think he cares as much as, he has to, but like in his mind, he probably does want to use the hostages as an excuse to prosecute the war to his full power. But in terms of like why the Knesset, or until a couple weeks ago, because something has changed in the last couple weeks, which probably is this new operation, which we can talk about in a second. Why, if you go back 3 months ago, the majority of the Israeli public, still generally was on favor, with continuing the war, is just because, I mean, I lived in Israel during the, Gilad Shalit deal. There's a lot to say about it. I think, a lot of, very, if I could put on my rabbi hat for a second, fascinating Jewish historic and Talmudic, sugya, portion of, what do you do when something like this happens? I don't know what I would do if I can go back in time and say yes or no. But what we do know happened is, in terms of utilitarian ethics, right, it certainly was not the right move. And, I don't know if we're going to say the same thing about some of the early deals and, 10 years from now. Hopefully we won't. Hopefully, there'll be no, further acts of terrorism against Israel because of that. But you easily could see that type of argument. And so, I don't know. That's sort of a little bit, I think, where much of the American Jewish community is at, and maybe why you had so much international support, because sadly the West has learned, obviously, September 11th, but even, in recent attacks and, throughout Europe over the last couple of years, what sort of terrorism can bring and everything like that. So I don't know. It's, in my head, there's a couple of big confounding variables. The hostages are one, on the other side. And then the fact that I don't trust Bibi, Ben-Gvir, and Smotrich at all, that's another confounding variable on the other side where, again, I'm not really willing to take them at face value because I wasn't 2 years ago when they were trying to do something that I viewed as illegitimate, aka got the judiciary. For listeners that have no idea what I'm talking about, go look at some of my podcasts, before October 7th, whenever I talked about Israel, that was the topic. Anyway, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, so I actually kind of agree with everything you said, but I probably have some general differences in how I look at them. So regarding the hostages and that's why Israel had support. Absolutely. And that's exactly what I'm saying, is that the way Israel has been treated in this war by governments, because people tend to look too much at like these student protesters as if they're the be all end all. Whatever, they don't matter. What matters is the governments of friendly nations, Western nations, the EU, Canada, US, Australia, those countries have treated Israel, I think, the way they treat any Western nation. They've given Israel a lot of leeway to act because this was, and I continue to say so, a just war, certainly at the beginning, because of the hostages and because of October 7th and so on and so forth. After Israel completely went nuts with its reaction, everyone can pinpoint exactly that point where they may, but at some point that happened, according to most observers of this war, including it sounds like yourself. Um, then they started reining in that support, but they still haven't completely turned on Israel. Only now is there some talk about sanctions. And I'm not, from what I'm hearing, it's not going to happen yet. They're only going to start talking about it. Maybe in a few months they'll do it. It looks like Israel has 18 months, 19 months so far of runway on this. That is not some kind of horrific anti-Semitic reaction by the Western world. It's just not. The reaction has been pretty normal. I think that if we were seeing these same pictures of children from Canadian or French or American planes, we'd have a very similar reaction. It wouldn't be
Well,
identical.
the argument to,
But it would be harsh.
yeah, the argument to, I think, push back on that, I don't know what I think of what I'm about to say, but I'll throw it at you anyway as a counter, is that, there is also a lot of, political and media manipulation here to the extent where, in the bombing of Dresden, if you had TikTok, many people would also be against that, but yet holistically, we sort of zoom out and most people say, well, the ends justify the means there. And so, in some future world, if we were to give the strongest steelman case for Israel continuing the war, not even a position that I necessarily agree with, one would say, well, yes, this is the bombing of Dresden of Israel, where essentially you got to rip off the Band-Aid and, but in 5 years from now, it'll be better, not just for Israel, but one could even be so bold as to say, even maybe for future Palestinian community if Hamas gets beaten back so far. So, there is a counter argument to be had there. Again, I don't know what I think of that, but I can imagine a lot of people sitting at home, wanting to make that argument through the, their phones back to you. So I'll throw it to you on behalf of a person listening.
Thank you. I'm glad you made that argument. Yeah, I hear it a lot. So regarding Dresden, a few things. First of all, the first thing you said about back in the time of Dresden, if they had TikTok, things would be looked at differently is right. And the world has just changed. What are you going to do, right? that just is what it is. It's nothing to do with Israel. That has to do with reality. Another thing that's changed since Dresden, by the way, is that international law has become more codified. Right? You have the Geneva Conventions now. You didn't have that back then. One of the reasons we have the Geneva Convention is sure because of Nazi crimes, but also because of Allied crimes. Listen, the bombing of Dresden, the bombing of Tokyo, and several other cities were war crimes. The Allies, just because they were the good guys in the battle against evil, doesn't mean they didn't commit crimes. oh boy, did they commit crimes. They bombed entire cities and they committed ethnic cleansing against Germans in the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. I would, however, say that as bad as what the Allies did in Dresden and so far is, and I don't want anyone telling me I'm pro-Nazi. The Nazis had to be defeated, obviously. But there's a major difference, which is that the Allies strove quickly and decisively to defeat the Nazis. In June 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. By May 1945, they were in Berlin. That is less than a year. Israel has been fighting in Gaza, which is an infinitesimal piece of land compared to the areas that the Allies took over for 19 months. It's not showing any signs of taking over Gaza and removing Hamas. It's decided to, I just put out a Substack today on this specific topic. Um, it's decided not to conquer all of Gaza. It's decided not to replace Hamas as a government. It might at some point decide to do that, but I'm not seeing that it is. The Allies were very clear. We're going to go into Berlin and we're going to put in a new government and we're going to take over every inch of Nazi land. And so it fought a war for a military purpose. So no one can accuse the Allies. Maybe you can accuse the Soviet Union. That's a whole different story. But no one can accuse the Western Allies of committing genocide against the Germans because in order to commit genocide, you need to have a purpose of destroying the people, not just commit war crimes. They totally committed war crimes, the Western Allies, but they treated the Germans well when they conquered them. They fed them, by the way, and they gave them a new government, and they didn't kill civilians on purpose, at least not in large numbers. They had a clear military goal, which they accomplished successfully. The IDF is not doing the same thing. I'm not blaming the IDF here, by the way. I'm blaming the government. But the command that needs to be given to the IDF in order to win this war: take over Gaza, every inch of Gaza, kill every Hamas member you run into, put in a new moderate government that is acceptable to the Palestinian people through some sort of negotiation, international mediation. Would be the equivalent of what the Allies did in Germany. Israel has refused, absolutely refused to do any of this. And what that means, and I can't be clear enough about this, is that Israel has refused to defeat Hamas. So when people say, oh, this is all justified in order to defeat Hamas, I'd say maybe. But Israel's not trying to defeat Hamas. And since it doesn't have a clear military goal in mind in Gaza, it's a severe war crime. It's not trying to defeat Hamas. Instead, it's trying to inflict harm on the Palestinian population. Imagine if the Allies kept going into Germany, bombing the Germans, killing German civilians, and pulling out. Going in, pulling out. Never going into Berlin. Adolf Hitler dies of old age in his bunker, or is assassinated and replaced by one of the other officials. That would not be the same war. That wouldn't be a military war. That would be a war of annihilation against the German people. And that's what we're seeing in Gaza. Israel is not trying to defeat Hamas. And every IDF officer I talk to knows this and agrees with this.
So I
Some of them
guess, I
say,
mean, yeah,
yeah,
just two things. I mean, one, because there also is the hostage piece, that I sort of mentioned before. But even putting the hostages aside, I mean, from your perspective, what then is the goal of what the Israeli government is ordering now? I mean, do you like, is your read that they are just trying to bomb, at random, just so, in hopes that, millions of Palestinians will decide to, flee out of Egypt through some court? I mean, like what, try to give, not to morally defend it, but like, you all of a sudden become the press conference for the current Israeli government and you sort of have to give the best, explanation to the Israeli people. Like, what are you doing?
oh, you mean, well, those are two different things.
No,
Because
no,
if
no.
I'm
Sorry.
if I'm
Like
doing a
you.
press conference from Netanyahu, I'd have to lie.
Yeah, yeah,
I'd
yeah.
have to
No, no. I'm
lie
saying like if
endlessly.
you were in Netanyahu's whole soul, you are able to read his mind. I mean,
Okay.
is in your opinion, is Bibi thinking I just have to keep on pretending like my goal is defeating Hamas and returning the hostages in order to keep prosecuting this war so that I don't have to go to court? I mean, is it really that shallow of a read, or is there something else happening here?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Netanyahu thinks that there are two to be a little bit more sympathetic to Netanyahu. Netanyahu thinks that there are two real big evils that Israel might face if this war ends, right? One is a Palestinian state, which throughout his whole life he's thought was a serious danger to Israel. He said that from day one, and he still thinks that. That's his ideological side, such as it is. The other is he thinks that Israel will be in severe danger if he doesn't lead it, because he thinks, and a lot of his supporters agree, that he's some great giant of statesmanship, and everyone else in the country is a mental midget compared to him, and no one else is worthy or able to defend Israeli security the way he can. So in order to look at himself in the mirror, and not say, oh, I'm destroying the Palestinian people and Israel in order to stay in power, which is what he's doing. He tells himself that he's preventing a Palestinian state. No one else could do it. And that he will continue to save Israel from its enemies. And he'll say to himself, look, I killed Nasrallah. I killed Sinwar. I brought Hezbollah to its knees in Lebanon. I'm going to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, which he's not doing very well, but that's, he'll tell himself all that. Therefore, it's an important element of Israeli security that I remain in power. So remaining in power for him, of course, it's self-aggrandizing. It's what he wants for selfish reasons. But he also believes the state is me. And that tends to happen to people who develop a dictatorial mindset when they run a country for too long. And listen, I've known Netanyahu. I've met him personally several times. Netanyahu didn't always wasn't always like this. He's always had a bad side, and I should say a self-aggrandizing side and an ideological side. To call it good and bad is the wrong way of looking at it. The ideological side has shrunk into the self-aggrandizing side.
Hmm. Do you identify, this is a total non sequitur. I will go back to what you said in a second. Do you identify as a Zionist? I know it's such a loaded question, but just, the way that you're speaking, it seems like the answer would be yes. But I'm just curious if you wear that on your sleeve.
I am absolutely a Zionist. I am no less a Zionist than I was when I supported this war. I think that there's really no other way for Jews to be safe in the Middle East, which is a really dangerous place without its own state and without its own army. And I think that in order to continue to exist that way in security in the long term, Israel needs to create a two-state solution, have two states living side by side, and have peace so that this stops happening.
Okay, so I do want to flag, even if I might disagree with your classification of genocide, I do think, a position like yours is super important because I have been saying this since the outset of the war, even, before you might have been against the war, even Jews who I was talking to on October 9th who were against the war, I've been saying this on campus for 2 years. Your stance on this war should have nothing to do with your stance on the legitimacy of Israel and Zionism. And that's been very difficult for people to really internalize because they've sort of gone either all in on one side or the other. I've known a lot of Jews who, because of their discomfort of the war, have become anti-Zionist. I know a lot of other people on the other side, and from my point of view, even if I have strong opinions, and even if obviously there's some correlation between the two, right? If you started off a radical anti-Zionist, you probably don't love Israel because of this war. And if you started off a rah-rah Zionist, you're probably more likely to give Israel more leeway than you would give, I don't know if Italy was doing this, but essentially the two shouldn't have anything to do with each other. So I appreciate that. You mentioned Hezbollah. So, another thing that dawned on me probably a year and a half ago, I ran this by, I had mentioned, asked you before we started recording if you know Alon Burstein. So I ran this by him on a podcast, and he did not agree with this analysis. So, if he one day listens to this, Alon, I'm going to try the argument on somebody else. But one of the things that dawned on me was, okay, so you had the Gilad Shalit deal, which, made a big imprint, I think, not just on, my psyche as, living in Jerusalem when that happened, but also on
what made us imprint
the Gilad Shalit deal, when Israel, and just for listeners' background, Israel traded about 900, a mixture of terrorists and Palestinian prisoners for one soldier who was kidnapped into Gaza in, I believe, 2007, but I might be off with the year. And one of them was Sinwar, who, orchestrated October 7th. So if I'm a regional actor, such as Hezbollah or the Houthis or Iran or even Hamas, my notes that I'm writing after the Gilad Shalit entire situation is we need to take more hostages. Hostages equal good for us. if I'm the Houthis or Hezbollah or Iran or, Palestinian Islamic Jihad or some new group we haven't heard of, yet, and I'm taking notes of the post October 7th, oh, it actually doesn't pay to take Israeli hostages because they are going to essentially just eradicate, everyone and everything. And this could amount to, I think, a strong moral argument in favor of the war, even if we think, there have been some war crimes and all the stuff that, you mentioned before about, of course, in war, there's going to be, crimes and, acts that, individually we would see as immoral, but for this, generality of, I do believe, and this is the argument that I want to run by you, that a group like Hezbollah is now less likely to take Israeli hostages in the future because of what just happened to Gaza. And I'm curious what you think of that argument.
Absolutely, absolutely. Listen, one of the goals of this war that was completely legitimate, not a pleasant goal at all, but completely legitimate, was to restore Israeli deterrence. Um, like I said, the fact that I think this war has got crossed all the boundaries doesn't mean that Israel doesn't need to live in security in what is a very, very tough neighborhood. And in order to do that, you have to have the respect of your neighbors. And in the Middle East, having the respect of your neighbors means showing that you are willing to use a lot of force. And I'm not so naive that I'm not fully aware of that. And um, after, one of the reasons October 7th happened to begin with was because Israel had lost its deterrence. They had been, due to various mistakes, been coddling Hamas for years, allowing them to have money, allowing them to have supplies, treating them like the responsible adult in Gaza while Islamic Jihad was the bad guy, a game that Hamas was playing. They were being played for chumps, Hamas. And the fact that they were being played for chumps by Hamas was something that was noticed by other actors like Hezbollah. And that's one of the reasons Hezbollah launched a war against Israel, thinking Israel's a paper tiger now and they're not going to do anything that serious to us. Look at how Hamas has played with them, and the Houthis also, thought we can do whatever we want. Israel is weak. Israel had to show that it wasn't weak. Israel had to fight a serious war in Gaza. I still think that it had to get the hostages back, which already had an opportunity to do that a while ago through various deals. And it also had to replace Hamas, which it now has an opportunity to do through various deals. And that's why I think that all the goals of the war have basically been achieved. You need to have a deal now that removes Hamas, something they're willing to do. You need to have all the hostages returned. The deterrence, as you said, and I 100% agree with you, has been achieved. You need to show that you're kind of crazy. You need to show that you are kind of unhinged, that you're willing to overreact to certain things, and so that no one messes with you. And that's the unfortunate reality in the Middle East. And Israel already did that months ago. Months ago. Israel already seems completely unhinged and crazy. Now in a bad way. It sort of seems like that in a good way, quote unquote, or I should say useful way, many months ago. Now it's in a kind of bad way. But you're right. I mean, it's not like this war has been a total wash. There have been some things achieved in this war. Um, Deterrence is definitely one of them. Israel's shown a lot of things. They've shown that it's willing to fight for a long time. It's shown that it's willing to sustain damage and losses. It's shown that it has technological capabilities people weren't aware of, especially when it comes to Iran and Lebanon, less in Gaza. Um, so that all has been things that Israel's shown and that have been positive achievements. It's also shown that it isn't really it's doesn't have any strategic leadership of any kind, and doesn't know when to stop. And that's also something that's been noticed, I think, by Israel's enemies. There's no strategic vision whatsoever at the helm. But regarding deterrence, yes, I think that another country or another terrorist organization would think twice before doing again what happened on October 7th. But unfortunately, deterrence only lasts for a certain amount of time. Um, I remember in 2005 when we finished the second Intifada, the Palestinian movement was shattered, absolutely shattered. And people thought that they would not be able to fight again for a very long time. And 20 years later, they fought again. A new generation comes up, they're oppressed, they have no hope, they take up arms, they do it again. So I think that we've made the Palestinians' lives so miserable, they're deterred. Hezbollah's deterred, but it's not going to last forever. You can't rely on deterrence forever. You need to take advantage of the fact that your enemy respects you and fears you, which is where we are right now, in order to reach diplomatic agreements.
There is a
And
little bit of a
that's where we
chicken and
are.
egg. You sort of, I think, brought up the classic chicken and egg question. I don't know if it's a paradox necessarily of, does oppression cause terrorism, or does terrorism put you in a situation where you are oppressed, which I think, has been sort of one of the questions about the Palestinians. The thing that always strikes me, and, I think, of course, it would be dumb for anybody, and I will use a, very non-academic term for some, I'll say it in the positive. Of course, if I am a 15-year-old in Gaza, I hate Israel a lot more now than I did 3 years ago. And so the likelihood of me being pushed into a much more radical, Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad group is much higher. On the other hand, the fact that you have, the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah or, various militias in Syria or the Iranian regime that seem to spend, all their time and effort, hating Israel, like the Houthis have never been oppressed by Israel. So, there is this question of, is there some a priori ideology that sort of underpins this that then has led Israel to take actions that have clamped down on the Palestinians, which has then created this, what I forget it, Amos Oz called the Achagad Yah machine, just, one act after another that sort of, causes a cycle. Because there is another framework to viewing this conflict. These are not, scholars of, the region, but, pop figures like, Sam Harris. I don't know if you listened to any of his content. Douglas Murray might be another one to add to this list, where, I mean, if I understand, Sam Harris's argument correctly, he would say, well, essentially any individual action, I don't remember if you had mentioned this before, or maybe we talked about this offline, what was discovered at Sde Teman, where, Israel was essentially abusing, like horrifically abusing, Palestinians who had been captured. And, many of these people like had nothing to do with Hamas. And, this was clearly something that is like, capital U unethical, like it should be condemned. That, okay, that is sort of like a minor case. And anytime that there's, not a minor case in terms of the moral aberration, but like from the grand scheme of things, there's sort of two ways to view this conflict. One is sort of on the ground level, and the other is sort of the bird's eye level. And their argument is that the bird's eye level is this very much is sort of a, class of civilizations between, what at least Douglas Murray calls, the death cults of, Hamas and Hezbollah, who really do, valorize death and martyrdom and really do view this as a complete war to the death between, Hezbollah or the Houthis and the West, and Israel sort of the epitome of the West, and, everything like that. And that's sort of their framework. And so that, within that framework, very much, the ends would justify the means in some way where you would even be able to absorb even all your criticism, meaning even if, according to some definition, like what we opened with, even if this was, a genocide of sorts, even so, there could be, and, a overarching, utilitarian ends justify the means argument for it. I'm curious what you think about that wider framework of, if somebody were to come in with that argument of saying, listen, in the grand scheme of things, to defeat this sort of clash of civilizations that, Israel is currently engaged in, it kind of does make sense to, prosecute this to the fullest, ability.
Yeah, so the Clash of Civilizations thesis is one that was you know, debunked and disregarded decades ago by anyone who seriously understands the Middle East, for various reasons. The main reason is moral, and we'll get to that in a minute. But there's also an empirical reason, which is that there is no sign that violence between Muslims and non-Muslims is greater than violence between Muslims and themselves. If anything, the most common and bloody wars in the Middle East have been between Muslims, whether we're talking about the war in
No, but
Syria.
Shal, this can kind of go into the thesis. In other words, there is an ideal, right? It doesn't have to be clash of civilizations of the Muslim world versus the Western world. It's
Well, that's the
people.
Clash of Civilizations
No,
thesis.
no, but like, let's sort of edit this of people who have fundamentalist ideologies where they believe they are in sole possession of, religious, political, and ethical truth that are willing to do whatever they can to punish those who disagree with them. And people like both of us, where even if we disagree, I think we're both generally capital liberals. Even if I disagree with you with things, I want you to live a very healthy life, and you should be blessed with, happiness. I don't want anything negative to happen to you, even if I ideologically disagree, right? But the difference would be in other cold, in Yemen or in Iraq, or in Syria, people who disagree on questions like this would then, the next logical step is to, how do I go and kill you? And so that's what I mean, that Israel is in some way faced with, with groups and ideologies that sort of have this capital F fundamentalist ideology, and there's sort of no way to, meaning if I started this Zoom call and I said, Shall, I want to kill you, and you thought that I was serious, you're probably not engaging in this, open, nuanced conversation with me. You're probably leaving the Zoom call and then, calling the FBI. And so, that would be more of the, switch of vantage points.
Well, that would be a great podcast, though, if you got people on it threatening
It
to
would be
kill them.
very short. YouTube might take
Very
it down,
short.
though. It might go against their,
Yeah, so that's no longer a clash of civilizations, right? That I'm not trying to be pedantic here. This matters. That's a clash of ideas. The clash of ideas, and it's very dangerous and harmful to frame this as the West against Islam, right? Because you're immediately setting billions of people against each other. If you set it as ideas, more liberal ideas, more tolerant ideas against less tolerant ideas, then it becomes something very different.
Yeah, so
It be,
let's go with that. Let's say, because I think this is more to Sam Harris's point than the class of civilizations, if I understand him correctly, where he says, you can be a liberal and we're both liberals, and a liberal can also think this war is good. A liberal can even think this war is the worst thing done in human history, but there's a certain mindset of liberalism, of free speech and freedom of religion that's implied there, where, if you go into the Houthis or Hezbollah, these are illiberal in the strongest senses. The obvious counter argument that one could make is that, well, there are elements of the Israeli right that are not nearly as bad, in my opinion, as Hamas or Hezbollah. I'm curious if you disagree, but are starting to have the same sort of fundamentalist, illiberal mentality. But I don't think that's, running the show quite yet.
well, okay, so that's another place where this runs into problems. You exactly pinpointed it, but I take it further than you take it. Hamas is clearly the enemy of the West, no matter how you look at it. Whether you look at it as a clash of civilizations in terms of religion, or whether you look at it in terms of ideas, they're an enemy. But the people who are running this war, and yes, they are running this war because they have veto on the war, are Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who are, in terms of religion and tolerance and all those sorts of things, not on the liberal Western side. They have more in common with Hamas than they have in common with John Locke. And so we have a war between those extreme elements. The liberal, or liberal might be the wrong word, the more moderate elements in both societies are sidelined. You have the people who are demonstrating in Kaplan and Shaiel Begin and so on and so forth. You have the people who are demonstrating against Hamas in Gaza. And you have President Mahmoud Abbas, who is saying that let's release the hostages and let's have a two-state solution. He's a lot more moderate than the Israeli government. I know that no one wants to hear that, but that's a fact. He's saying things the Israeli government is not willing to say. He's willing to say that there should be a two-state solution. Israeli government is not. So what we have here isn't liberals against extremists. We have extremists against extremists. We have fundamentalists against fundamentalists. There's moderate elements in both societies. Neither is in control. And in Israel, demographically speaking, it looks increasingly unlikely that the moderates will be in control. They could win the next election and so on and so forth, but in the long term, it looks like they're not likely to be in control. And there's a symbiotic relationship between people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Hamas. They like and respect each other in a way. Sure, they'd kill each other if they got the chance, don't get me wrong, but they also respect each other and need each other. Smotrich has gone on Israeli TV, said that Hamas is an asset to him. Why is it an asset? Because it delegitimizes the entire Palestinian movement. It makes sure that there can't be a Palestinian state. It weakens the Palestinian Authority. And therefore, it's good for him and his plans of ethnic cleansing and building settlements and so on and so forth. Hamas is the same thing. They say, we don't want to deal with the Israelis. The Israelis are all monsters. When Smotrich and Ben Gvir are running the country, all the Arabs can say, yeah, look, they're monsters. What are we going to do? We need someone to defend us against these monsters who are coming to perform ethnic cleansing on us. I guess we have to support Hamas. They're not going to support Hamas for any other reason. Hamas isn't giving them anything. So you have an alliance against the moderate elements in both societies. And they cooperate with each other. They even fund each other when needed. You know, as we saw with Netanyahu allowing money in for Gaza. So the whole thesis is incorrect. And in general, if you look at the history of the Crusades and you look at all these periods that people pinpoint as struggles between Islam and Christianity and all that, there was a lot of cooperation, a lot of corruption where the sides were helping each other. There were Crusader kingdoms who paid off Muslims. There were Muslims who paid off Crusader kingdoms to attack the sheik that they didn't like.
No, no,
This
no.
is human nature.
I totally agree that to
No, no,
make
I'm
this,
not
and this
pushing
is,
back against
yeah, yeah.
you.
No, no, no,
I'm
just
trying to make a point
general,
here.
you know,
Yeah, yeah,
the one guy sitting at home who, you know, this is
yeah,
meant for
yeah,
you, you know, you are wrong. No, I'm kidding.
yeah. You
No, I
bastard.
mean, yeah, people that try to, you know, over extrapolate to a generalized and essentialized argument about Islam are just, you know, on the face of it incorrect. I mean, you know, I've said this a bajillion podcasts before. Someone gives me a time machine and says, anytime before 1900, do you want to go to an Islamic land and a Christian land? I'm picking Islamic lands 9 times out of 10. That's sort of historically obvious. So any essentialized argument about the nature of the good-hearted Christians versus the, warmongering Muslims, you know, that's sort of historically ridiculous. But it would be, you know, in the 21st century or the 20th century, not even have anything to do with Islam. Put that to the side. You know, there's other, you know, I don't know, North Korea and Russia, you know, are also groups that are sort of, you know, capital I illiberal. And, you know, this sort of like there is this wider cosmic battle. You know, I think with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, certainly it's making it, you know, very difficult. I would push back, you know, one on both the quality and quantity. And I'm curious, you know, what you think of this argument. I think 3 podcasts ago, I talked to a woman who ended up having to flee Egypt. She was part of the Arab Spring. Her name is Dalia Ziyada. And you know, Egypt, which we tend to think of as a moderate Muslim country, you know, just the type of anti-Semitism she encountered. I'm not talking about anti-Zionism, you know, vicious anti-Semitism she grew up just learning in, you know, the public school system in Egypt, to then to the point where she decided that Israel was not the, you know, Satan. And, you know, she eventually had to flee Egypt because she was getting death threats after October 7th. I'm not saying things are great in Israel if you're a progressive Haaretz commentator that is, you know, saying that this war is terrible and a genocide, but you don't have to flee. I mean, at least yet, you know, but there isn't really any, you know, serious threat to your life. You don't see people like fleeing Tel Aviv who are criticizing the government. And so, you know, that's even a moderate, you know, country in the Middle East such as Egypt. You then take, you know, Syria and Lebanon and other countries, and just to sort of, you know, draw this argument whole, you know, the argument is that, you know, Israel really is, you know, the front lines in this wider, you know, world clash of ideas of, you know, open versus closed societies. You know, again, maybe somebody like Itamar Ben-Gvir, you know, confounds that a lot because this is also happening within governments. And I mean, I think you have, you know, some elements in America also of people that are fundamentally pushing for, you know, closed societies within America. And I'm sure you have people within, you know, Iran. I mean, you certainly have people within Iran now who are fighting against the Iranian regime. You know, you had the Masa Amini protests and everything a couple of years ago. You know, I'm sure that's continuing in some way that isn't getting enough media attention. You know, so it's not to say, you know, full categorizations of, you know, this country versus this country. But the argument, at least as I understand, you know, Sam Harris and Douglas Murray would say, you know, when you zoom back in enough, when we're talking about this in 100 years, sure, we might say, you know, on a podcast, yes, the British did a lot of bad in the bombing of Jejin, and, you know, they did a lot of things that we would say are immoral, and America's bombing of Japan, you know, probably we can sit here and say that was immoral, but like, generally none of us want to run that I mean, I won't say none of us. I don't want to run that counterfactual where Dresden is not bombed, even if, you know, if I was some pundit sitting there in the 1940s, I could have said, well, you know, there is probably a better way to do this. So that's more the framework. And again, that could be true whether or not one thinks this is genocide, right? So we've sort of moved on from that conversation because at some point, whether or not, you know, what you classify this as is sort of irrelevant to that wider argument. And so, you know, I don't know, a lot of moving pieces, but I'll give it to you. There's one more question that I want to ask, but I'll let you answer that one
Okay,
first.
yeah. So, I'm not unsympathetic to the things that you said. I remain a very committed liberal. I'm not a postmodernist progressive. So I truly believe that our Western values, at their best, when it comes to democracy and protection of human rights and the rights of the individual, is superior to any form of religious fundamentalism, including, but not limited to, Islamic fundamentalism. No question about that. Egypt also, I should note, is not considered a particularly, um, you know, moderate Arab country in terms of its public opinion. It's true that its foreign policy is relatively moderate, but
I
it's
mean, it
actually
is allied. I mean, it's one of the few. I mean, just for listeners, you know this, of course,
hundred
that it
percent.
is, officially allied with Israel,
Well, allied is a
or
strong
not
word. Has a peace
allied.
agreement.
They
Yeah,
officially have a peace agreement.
yeah. So for the benefit of the listeners, I think Egypt. There's a strong case for Egypt being the most anti-Semitic country in the Arab world. I've definitely heard experts on Egypt make that case. I'm no expert in Egypt, but I've heard that many times. There seems to be a particularly strong anti-Semitism there, and that by standards of a place that has a serious anti-Semitism
I knew it.
problem.
It was the Pesach story. Every year we celebrate
Exactly.
it. Every year we're rubbing it in their face.
By the way, I have this in my podcast on history. There's a strong theory that anti-Semitism was invented by Egyptians.
Yeah, the Greeks, like in
Well, the Greek-speaking Egyptians.
yeah, yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? You know
Yeah,
that
yeah.
history?
So just to
Yeah,
spell this out, I
okay.
don't think I've ever talked about this on the podcast. David
Yeah.
Nuremberg has a whole book called Anti-Judaism where he starts off his thesis. A lot of times people bring it back to, early Christianity, but he says essentially that there were alternative stories that were written about the Exodus in, the second and third century BCE Alexandria, which had a big Jewish population and also a big, Egyptian population there as well. And that specifically Passover, I've started joking about Passover before, but that is actually part of an interesting historic thesis about anti-Semitism. It's obviously not serious in a 2025 sense.
Well, it is. Yeah, his name was Manetho. And Manetho wrote the first anti-Semitic tract in history, and he wasn't Greek. He wrote in Greek, of course, but he was Egyptian. And exactly like you said, he was pissed off. He was pissed off at the Egyptian Exodus story, and he reversed it, and he made the Jews the bad guys. And that is the first known case of anti-Semitism. So you're not wrong that anti-Semitism in Egypt literally has a longer history than anywhere else. But that's just an interesting aside. Um, yeah, the more moderate countries are United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Tunisia. Not that they're all that great, but those are probably the more moderate countries. Oman, maybe. Anyway, um, the other thing we were talking about was wait, what was the rest of the question before? I got completely sidetracked.
This big, I guess this big
I,
clash of ideas ends
Clash of
justifying the
ideas.
means. Yeah.
So I'm sympathetic to that. If we're going to do this clash of ideas, in a sense that will actually advance democracy and liberalism, war is really not the way to do it. Or at least war needs to be used very sparingly in a very focused manner, right? What needs to be done in order to advance exactly that is to put a moderate Palestinian government in Gaza with some association with the Palestinian Authority, with some reforms so that there's support from the Palestinian people that can work towards creating a more tolerant Palestinian society with better education, so on and so forth. Bombing the bejesus out of them will not make Palestinians less radical. That doesn't work. That's not how things happen. So I don't see that this war in any way advances that. And I think that it's also making a lot of people in the West turn against Western liberal values because they see the West supporting what they view, in my opinion, correctly as a genocide. That's not inspiring confidence in liberalism. It's not inspiring confidence in democracy. It's also turning Muslim immigrants radical in a way that they were starting to turn in the other way. Basically, what I'm saying in the larger scale is this: if we want to influence Muslims to be more moderate, and there's been plenty of progress in that way. Anyone who has Muslim friends knows exactly what I'm talking about. There's so many moderate Muslims out there who are reasonable. There's millions of them. If we want to create more of them, we need to have more dialogue and less war. We need to have more peace treaties and interfaith dialogues and less bombs. The bombs aren't going to pursue democracy. If after the Iraq War, Anyone thinks that bombs are going to help us spread democracy in the Middle East, they're dreaming.
So I had one more small question and then one more general question for you. Let me just think how to phrase this. I mean, I don't know if you have a specific, date or occasion in mind, but in your mind, when should have Israel stopped the war? In other words, because you're not one of those that on October 8th Israel shouldn't have gone to war. So, just because I think, in 20 years from now, when we're still talking about this, and who knows how this is going to end, there's going to be people who are going to say things like the war was a mistake or the war was not a mistake. And I'll probably be sitting there, in my podcast, 20 years from now, it'll be much more popular. I'll have, hundreds of thousands of subscribers then. And,
For
I'll be
sure.
saying, well, it depends what you mean. What part of the war? There was different farts and different phases. So I'm curious, if you thought about this, is there a specific point where you think, okay, the first, three things, Israel did was good, but like this is the red line of like when Israel clearly should have realized that they should have stopped the war.
I'll answer that in two ways. First is if they pursued what would have been a much better strategy to win the war, which would have been you just go in and you take over Gaza. And by just, I don't mean it would have been simple, but in the sense of you take over location after location until all of Gaza is taken over. Then you negotiate with Hamas. That would have been one alternative. That would have taken quite a few months. That would have taken maybe like 8 months or something like that, from what I've heard from experts in the army. Then there's if Israel followed the current strategy, because there's an answer for that too, because this current strategy could have kind of worked. In May, June, there was a good offer on the table to end the war. President Biden had a day after plan. That would have been a good time to reach an agreement. Israel had already achieved the deterrence that you and I talked about. Israel would have gotten the hostages back, and it would have started to move towards a more moderate government. So May, June, July talks definitely could have succeeded. Israel would have had to make concessions. Those concessions would have involved withdrawing from Gaza and ending the war, things that it wasn't willing to do. But in return for those concessions, it could have gotten enough that it could have called the war a success. It did not do that. So either one of those things would have happened. Yes, you're right. The longer this war goes on, the worse it gets, the more the whole thing is going to seem like a mistake. The more October 7th is going to be forgotten, and the more Israeli crimes are going to be remembered. We've already passed that point, unfortunately, where I think Israeli crimes are going to be remembered more than October 7th. But I think we may reach a point where October 7th is almost seen as an aside. People say, okay, 1,000 people were killed, but you killed 100,000 people. So why are we still talking about those 1,000 people? That's where we're going to end up. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think we could have ended this war in May or so successfully with a
got it.
victory, with an Israeli victory.
Last question, then let you close with whatever you want. Your I don't I just met you an hour and a half ago on Zoom here, but I'm curious your interaction with the Jewish community. I know you live in Los Angeles. I mean, because the way that you're speaking now, I'd imagine if a local Students for Justice in Palestine chapter would not want to have you speak there because one, you're a Zionist, you are speaking about Israel in a very nuanced way, even in a way that I disagree with. On the other hand, I can't imagine a lot of Hillels, I work for Hillel. I can't imagine a lot of Hillel saying, you're exactly who I want speaking at, my Shabbat dinner. And so I'm curious, what is your sort of, what is your community and Jewish community and, how is that being received? And, are you disconnecting this? Are you feeling like you're being ostracized by elements of the Jewish community? I'm not talking about the comments you get on Twitter. Everyone gets terrible comments on Twitter. I don't usually use Twitter, but I get terrible comments on Facebook and YouTube and everything else. But I don't know, what is your, in real life, what have been the social benefits and or repercussions of you as somebody who's clearly very knowledgeable and very opinionated, coming out with opinions that the majority of the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community says, Shaiel is a little bit beyond the pale and he is now like anti-Israel, or, some might even say anti-Semitic. Not my words, but I'm imagining some people, listening, just kind of speak to me about that.
Yeah, so I'm not particularly heavily involved in the Jewish community in Los Angeles. I never really have been. I have my Israeli friends here. I have my Jewish American friends here. It hasn't affected my relationship with any of them meaningfully. I've had some pretty harsh arguments. I probably lost more friends on October 7th around October 7th who um, defended October 7th. I had a few friends, not a majority or anything like that, but I had two, three friends who defended October 7th, who I stopped talking to on my initiative. One of them I've since made up with because they've moderated and then I've moderated. Two of the others I still don't. Once I came out with genocide and all that, I got some pretty angry messages from close friends, but no one cut off relations with me. But what really surprised me was how many people agreed with me. I got messages from people, some I knew, some I didn't know, saying that it's great to have someone speak for us in the sense that there's really no, you said, you're ostracized by both sides. There's really no one out there saying, I still love Israel, but Israel's committing genocide. And there's a lot of people who feel that way. And I love my country. I love my country deeply. And I want it to stop doing what it's doing. And I'm not alone. There's a lot of people like that. Now, as far as my community is concerned, I'm a member of two organizations. Your friend Alon is a member of one of them, a member of Unacceptable, and I'm a member of Standing Together, which means that I'm part of a community of Israelis who are very much against Netanyahu, and especially in the case of Standing Together, very much against this war and against its excesses. So that is a strong community. And one thing I think Americans aren't fully aware of, because they know the Israelis on Twitter and they know the Israelis in the Valley or whatever, is how many Israelis are either against this war completely or are very skeptical of this war. According to most polls, most Israelis want this war to stop. The vast majority is because they don't want the hostages to die and because they don't think that Netanyahu was running it responsibly. That's the median Israeli thinks that. The not so median Israeli, 20% or whatever, think that Israel's also committing terrible crimes. And that's another reason that Israel needs to stop. I don't feel like I'm alone at all. And that's my community. But yes, American Jews tend to view Israel as more of an issue of identity than an issue of policy. So
Well,
then they're either violently for or violently against. I don't fall into either of those camps.
fair. And just, if you have just 5 more minutes just to think this out, I have said for a long time I would be much more publicly critical of Israel if I lived in Israel, because
You
if
would,
I
I can
lived
tell.
if I lived in Israel, conversations about Israel I would view the same as conversations about American politics here, right? If I'm going to criticize Trump or criticize Biden or anything like that, that's not a part of my fundamental identity. I don't strongly, my primary identity is not somebody who affiliates with a certain politician or political action. That's sort of like, small beans compared to my, identities. The American Jewish community, just speaking on behalf of a representative of, a major American Jewish community, Hillel on campus, is those two identities, partially for good historic reason by both Israel and American Jewish community, but also partially from people trying to discredit where, you're gonna have, you obviously know this, but just for listeners, I mean, Israel, I'm not talking about the modern political entity of Israel, but the idea of Israel, the land of Israel, the ideal of Israel is inseparable from Judaism and Jewish tradition. And so you're going to have a lot of that intersect with, if I say next year in Jerusalem after my Passover Seder, is that a Zionist slogan? Is that a pro-Israel slogan? Is that a Jewish slogan? Yes to all three. And so, but that's something that the non-Jewish public in America is sort of unable to understand, to the point where for an American Jewish community, oftentimes attacks against Israeli policy, harsh attacks, say, condemning things as ethnic cleansing and war crimes and genocide, that tends to be felt a lot more, personally, in a way that, like, I think these are very interesting issues. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, one was because, I have been following your posts and, again, as I open with, I agree with some, I disagree with others, as, has sort of been obvious from this conversation. But I do think it's a super important point to touch on that, the two questions of Zionism versus non-Zionism, these general questions of, do Jews have right to self-determination in their indigenous homeland in some capacity, without drawing any specific borders and specific policies, but that general idea has nothing to do with what you think of a war that started in 2023 to 2025, 80-ish years after Israel was founded, by groups that have ideologies that are nothing like the ethos of the original Zion. I mean, in my mind, those two things are obviously not the same at all. I could imagine why a lot of people, in their mind, for them to see something like somebody saying this is a genocide, that in their mind immediately categorizes them as, like, there's black and white, and you are now on the black, and I am not, or you're on the white, if you're talking about, very anti-Israel. So I think this was really interesting. Obviously, for people that are still listening, I think we've been talking for an hour and 25 minutes. I still have to call this, on podcast and YouTube, a debate because, that of course drives the, clicks and, anything for the, algorithm. I'm, mostly kidding there, but no, I really appreciate it. I don't know if you have any final thoughts or anything to bring this home.
No, I really love the way you finished this. That regardless of what we think of what Israel is doing now, regardless of what we think about the Israeli government, that has no bearing on whether Israel should keep existing or not. That's a very important point, very important to me, and it gets swallowed up a lot in what I say, even though I try to emphasize it. Germany continued to exist after the Holocaust. Not that I'm comparing; it's not the same. Serbia continued to exist after what it did. That's more similar. Yeah, countries that have committed horrible crimes. Turkey has committed much worse crimes than Israel has over the years. Continues to exist, has a right to exist. Same thing with Israel. What you need to focus on is not destroying Israel, because then Israel will never reform. Israel will never change because it will always be self-defending itself. Uh, it needs to be reformed. It needs to do better. It needs to continue to exist and needs to stop what it's doing, and it needs to act better than it is. And it needs for the Palestinians to also have the right to self-determination, not at Israel's expense, but side by side. That's the only solution. And the two-state solution requires Israel existing as well. And just because Israel is doing something wrong doesn't mean it shouldn't exist. Every country does things that are wrong.
Amazing. Well, thank you for your time. I'm sure people listening have many follow-up questions. So if you do, feel free to comment them. Maybe I'll, hit you up in a couple weeks or months to do a follow-up episode. But I
Happy to.
really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.